Chapter 11. The City Below. The second bearing seated on the seventh morning. Rowan tested the alignment by rotating the cable drum by hand, listening for the sound of metal moving against metal at the tolerances he had spent 6 days fitting. The drum turned and the bearings rolled, the sound smooth and continuous, a low hum that carried no catches, no skips, no indication of friction where friction should not be. Marcus stood behind him, not touching the mechanism, his arms folded across his chest. He had watched every cycle since the test began without making a sound. "Spin it again," Marcus said. Rowan spun it again. The drum completed 3 full rotations under the momentum of his push, decelerating gradually, the sound constant throughout. He checked the caliper one more time. The bearing seats were within tolerance, the housing halves aligned, and the split mated cleanly along the full length of the cylinder. "It holds," Rowan said. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "It does," he said. He crossed to the platform and initiated the full retraction test, engaging the spring mechanism that wound the cable onto the drum under tension. The cable tightened and the drum rotated, and the new housing absorbed the load without deflection, the bearings distributing the rotational force across the housing for the first time in 6 months. The cable wound smoothly, all 30 meters of it spooling onto the drum in even layers, the tension consistent throughout the cycle. Marcus watched without speaking, his hands gripping the platform rail, his knuckles white against the painted steel. The mechanism stopped and the cable was fully retracted. Marcus released the rail. "I will inform Dr. Okoye that the repair is complete," Marcus said. His voice was level, but there was a relief working under it that he had not managed to hide. "And I will inform the council that Helionaut 2 is operational." Rowan wiped the steel dust from his hands with a rag and set it on the workbench. 6 days of hand-fitting and file work and remeasurement had turned a block of scavenged steel into a precision component that would hold under forces his mountain experience had never required him to imagine. He felt the quiet satisfaction that came when the solar collector survived a storm. The mechanism worked. The Helionaut would fly when the crew was ready to take it up. "Go," Marcus said. "Take the afternoon, you have earned it." Okoye released the antibiotics within the hour. 3 blister packs in a sealed cloth pouch, the foil still bright. The printing on the packets still legible after 72 years. She placed them in Rowan's hands with the same precision she applied to everything, and he closed his hand around them. They weighed almost nothing. He put them in the inner pocket of his coat, against his chest. Pip was waiting at the bottom of the stairwell. She already knew about the repair. News in Meridian traveled fast, and Pip's friends carried most of it. "You finished," she said. Rowan touched his coat where the antibiotics rested, and paid. "Good. Come with me." She started walking, not toward the upper levels where Rowan had spent most of his time in Meridian, but down. Below the ground floor, below the market courtyard, below the farming terraces. Down a stairway he had not noticed before, cut into the stone foundation, lit by oil lamps in wall brackets that cast their familiar warm light on the rough stone. "Where are we going?" Rowan asked. "The parts of the city you haven't seen," Pip said. "The parts that keep the parts you have seen working." The lower levels were darker, damper, and cooler than the inhabited floors above. The air thickened as they descended, taking on the smell of earth and moisture and something faintly sweet that Rowan associated with active cultivation. The corridors narrowed and the ceilings dropped lower as they went, the walls unfinished stone that ran wet in slow trickles. The sounds of the city above faded with each turn of the stairs, replaced by the steady drip and murmur of water moving through stone, and the echo of their footsteps carrying ahead of them and returning. The water filtration room came first. A chamber the size of the Helionaut hangar, and the sound of it reached Rowan before the sight did. Water in motion, the continuous pour and trickle of a spring feeding through a pipe into the first basin. The softer sound of water percolating through charcoal and emerging from the other side. The steady drip of filtrate passing from basin to basin. 3 large stone and concrete containers stood arranged in series. The first held charcoal packed between perforated metal screens, the second sand layered over gravel, and the third a fibrous material Rowan did not recognize. "Filter mats," Pip said, noticing his attention. Woven from cultivated fiber, the lower-level crew developed it, catches particles the sand misses. She knew the 3-person crew by name, greeted each of them, asked about the output rate. One of the crew, a man with permanently damp sleeves, showed Rowan where the first filter basin was developing a crack in the concrete seal. Water seeped through the crack with a thin, persistent hiss, bypassing the charcoal entirely, and the repair required a waterproof compound they did not currently have. Rowan studied the crack and the seepage. "Resin mixed with lime powder," he said. "We use it on the mountain for the rain-catch seals. It cures hard and waterproof." The man stared at him. "You know a formula for waterproof sealant?" "My mother developed it," Rowan said. "I can write it down for you before we leave." Next, they reached the cultivation chambers. 6 rooms, each maintained at different humidity and temperature levels, each growing a different edible species. Ghost caps in the coolest room, their pale forms rising from beds of composted material in neat rows. Dim bread in the warmest room, spreading across wooden racks in thick flat sheets that would be dried and ground into flour. Light clusters, the bright blue variety, cultivated near the water filtration outflow where mineral content in the runoff promoted their growth. A woman tending the ghost cap beds explained the rotation system. Each chamber produced continuously, with harvesting staggered across a 4-day cycle to ensure a steady food supply. The yields had been declining. The ventilation system that circulated air through the chambers was failing. A hand-cranked fan mechanism that had been in continuous operation for 8 years and was, the woman said, simply wearing out. Rowan could hear it before she finished explaining. A grinding, irregular rhythm from the far end of the chamber. The sound of metal turning against metal with too much friction and not enough lubrication. He had heard that sound before, on his father's collector and on a dozen other things since. It was the sound of a bearing dying. Rowan studied the fan mechanism, a crank, a drive shaft, a set of fan blades in a housing. He could see the problem from 3 meters away. The drive shaft bearing was worn, the same class of failure he had just repaired on the Helionaut at a much smaller scale. "Do you have a replacement bearing?" he asked. The woman looked at him the way the water crew man had looked at him when he mentioned the sealant formula. "Who is he?" she asked Pip. "He's the person who just fixed the Helionaut," Pip said. "And he's going to fix your fan too if you have a bearing for it, which I'm betting you don't, but Marcus might. He hoards parts, and I'll ask him for you." The woman did not have a bearing of the right size. Pip wrote the dimensions on a strip of paper. The way she wrote down everything anyone in 3 settlements needed, and folded it into the inner band of her sleeve. The fan kept grinding. It would keep grinding until a replacement bearing turned up. They continued downward. The library occupied a room on the lowest inhabited level, sealed behind a heavy door with rubber gaskets around its frame. The room inside was kept artificially dry, the humidity controlled by desiccant packets arranged along the walls and replaced on a weekly rotation. When the librarian Greta opened the heavy door, the air that came through was different from anything Rowan had encountered in Meridian. Dry, obviously, but beneath the dryness was a smell he recognized from his own small shelf of books, old paper, cloth binding, the faint chemical sharpness of the desiccant compounds. It was the smell of paper being kept alive against the damp. After the water sounds and the grinding fan, the library was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. The sealed door holding the underground noise outside. Inside, Shelves lined every surface, and on those shelves stood roughly 200 books in various states of preservation. Greta was a small woman whose age was hard to guess, and she handled each volume Rowan touched with the watchful attention of a person whose patient was on the table. The collection ranged from technical manuals to novels to children's picture books, each one wrapped in protective cloth, each one catalogued in a ledger that hung from a chain beside the door. Greta watched Rowan for a few moments, the kind of watching she did with anyone whose hands looked competent. Then she went to a low shelf and brought back a book wrapped in extra layers of cloth. She set it on the table and unwrapped it slowly. The spine had failed completely. The binding glue had turned to brown powder and fallen out of the inner seam, and the pages were held together only by the cloth she had wound around the body of the book. "I cannot fix it," she said. "I know what the book is, and I know what it does, and I have read it twice. But the binding is past me. I keep asking people who pass through. Most of them do not know either." Rowan looked at the book for a long time. He turned it carefully in his hands, examining the powdered glue and the brittle separation of the signatures. He had worked metal his whole life, and he had worked the wood of farm tools, and he could keep most mechanical things running until the bearings refused. He had never bound a book. "I do not know how to repair this," he said. "I'm sorry." Greta nodded. She wrapped the book in its cloth and put it back on its low shelf, and Rowan understood from her unsurprised face that she had asked the question of every traveler whose hands looked capable, and had not yet found her answer. Rowan found the atmospheric science textbook on the third shelf from the left, between a water engineering manual and a book on soil chemistry. The spine was intact, the pages dry and mostly readable. He opened it to the chapter on atmospheric particulates and read standing up, his back against the shelf, the lamp light sufficient for the large print of the textbook format. He read about particulate density in the upper atmosphere, about the mechanisms of atmospheric clearing, both natural and induced, about the roles of precipitation, gravitational settling, and biological filtration. This last category included a section on marine filtration, the feeding behavior of baleen whales, which processed enormous volumes of seawater through their baleen plates, removing particulates and small organisms in the process. The whales did not clean the ocean on purpose. They fed, and the cleaning was the consequence. The analogy landed before Rowan had finished the page. Filter feeders not in water but in air, consuming not plankton but the particulate matter that thickened the clouds. Not cleaning the sky on purpose but feeding, with the clearing as the consequence of the feeding. He turned pages. Echolocation in marine mammals, frequency ranges and harmonic structures, communication patterns that varied by species and by pod and by individual. The complexity of whale song, which researchers before had spent decades recording and analyzing without fully decoding. The chorus, described in the vocabulary of a world that had once had oceans full of whales, translated forward to a world where the whales lived in clouds and sang to each other through 12 kilometers of gray. He needed to give this book to Marcus, even though that was not the mission. The mission was antibiotics, and the antibiotics were in his coat. And that should have been the end of his business in Meridian. But Marcus had spent 3 years recording data without the framework this textbook provided. And the textbook had sat on this shelf the entire time, 40 meters below the hangar where he worked. "You could stay here," Pip said. Rowan looked up from the textbook. Pip was leaning against the opposite shelf, a book in her hands that she was not reading, watching him. "They need mechanics," she said. "The water system needs you. The ventilation needs you, and Marcus needs you. You would never run out of things to fix." "My mother is waiting," Rowan said. "Yeah." Pip put the book back on the shelf, running her finger along the spine as she slid it into place. "But after?" Rowan did not answer. The question did not need an answer yet, and the silence between them was not the kind that demanded one. He marked the page he had been reading and closed the textbook gently. He carried it with him when they left the library. They climbed one level to the school. A single room, 12 children seated at desks salvaged from a before-school somewhere in the ruins below. A teacher standing at a chalkboard working through arithmetic. The children ranged from perhaps 5 to 12 years old, quiet and focused, their faces bent over the problems in front of them. Rowan stood in the doorway and watched. Pip stood beside him, and he noticed that her restless motion had stopped. Her hands had dropped quiet at her sides, the way they did when she was paying full attention. Her eyes tracked the children, the teacher, the chalkboard. She had told him once that she had never sat in a classroom. Whatever she felt watching these children, she kept it off her face. Pinned to the wall beside the chalkboard was a chart, ruled by hand on a sheet of salvaged graph paper. The grid lines drawn in pencil by a child's hand, slightly uneven. The squares not quite square. Each day of the past 12 months was marked with a number, the light window duration, measured in minutes. 165 entries. The numbers filled in by the teacher in careful print, fluctuating within a narrow range. The variations small enough to be noise. But the trend line was not noise. Drawn in red wax crayon beneath the daily numbers, it rose. Slowly, so slowly that any individual day's measurement would show nothing. A minute here, half a minute there, and sometimes the line dipped. And sometimes it plateaued. And sometimes the data scattered across a wide enough range to make the trend invisible. But across 12 months, taken as a whole, the red crayon line climbed. The light windows were getting longer. Rowan looked at the chart for a long time before he moved. Then he reached out and pressed his finger against the red line where it crossed the most recent week, feeling the wax under the pad of his finger, feeling that the line was a real mark made on real paper by a real teacher in a real city, 40 meters above a library that he had just walked out of, with a book under his arm. He pulled his notebook from his coat pocket and opened it to his own measurements. 6 years of light window durations recorded by lamplight at a kitchen table on a mountain 3 days' walk to the north. He held the notebook up against the chart on the wall and matched the lines. He had been right. He had been measuring his own light window for 6 years. And he had been right. And the proof was here on a school wall tracked by a teacher he did not know in a city he had not known existed when he left his mountain. He had to read the numbers on the wall twice to be sure he had read them at all. The trend was real, and it was not an artifact of measurement error or seasonal drift in his observations. The flums were feeding, and the sky was clearing, and the children at these desks were being taught to track it. He closed the notebook. His hand was not quite steady when he put it back in his coat pocket. He looked at the chart one more time, at the red line rising through a year of careful measurement. And then he turned and walked back up the corridor with the atmospheric textbook under his arm. Pip followed without speaking. On the 3rd level, Rowan stopped at a window overlooking Meridian's central space. The after-window dim had settled over the city. The oil lamps lit in the corridors. The foot traffic reduced to its quieter evening pattern. On his mountain, survival required one person's effort. Here it required everyone's: the water crew with their broken seal, the cultivation woman with her failing fan, Greta with her ledger and her ruined binding, the teacher with her chart and her 12 students. Pip's question was still in the air between them. Rowan had not answered it because the answer was not yet a thing he could give. His mother was waiting, the antibiotics were in his coat, and the textbook was under his arm. The mountain was 3 days behind him and 3 days ahead. And now another day in Meridian to add to the count. Because he was not leaving without putting this book in Marcus's hands first. He did not have an answer for what came after that. Pip was not asking him for one. Rowan stood at the window for a long time. Then he turned and went up to find Marcus.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.